The protagonist, locked up in her prison, broke the plate that was brought to her by the maid and loudly, childishly declared that she did not want to eat it, and she would like something else. But the disgruntled girls looking at her wondered, has the protagonist gone mad? Because she just nearly maimed a servant girl while she was breaking dishes. But she just grudgingly said she wouldn't eat it and demanded something else, like sweets. And then she started yelling at the girls and demanding more food. And the girls just covered their ears in an attempt to drown out her screams. But at the next moment, the main character approached them, and then the girl, frightened away from her, started screaming that the main character was trying to bite her, and tried her best to get away from her. But the protagonist didn't seem to care at all. She kept shouting that she wanted another meal, and it seems that she was absolutely not going to give up. And then one insanely disgruntled maid who was watching this picture from the side could not stand such shouting and simply agreed to the terms of the main character. Then she threw her piece of bread on the floor, as if she were caring not for a human, but for a dog. But the protagonist did not seem offended at all, and only joyfully looking at the bread bent down to pick it up. And then she repeated over and over again that she loved the bread because it was very tasty. And then she began to eat it, holding it with her gaunt, hungry hands. And the other girls just stared at it with contempt, unable to find the strength to continue being here. And so the maid squeamishly declared that she was now sick and could no longer look at the protagonist. Not only did she look awful, but she smelled awful, and another excited maid approached her and started to take her out and suggested she take a walk in the fresh air to make her feel better. But she just kept asking how long they had to woo the title character. Besides, they couldn't even take her life because of the curse, so they just had to torture her. In the end, as soon as the door slammed shut, the protagonist sat tiredly on her bed and began to think about the fact that she is insanely tired of it all. Then began to remember that she was in the Holy Empire of Trump, and it was a state in which periodically people were born who were chosen by the gods, and the people chosen by the gods are those who were sent by the Almighty to prove the promise that was made to the first emperor for his profound righteousness. And these people were born with God's pattern located somewhere on their bodies. And as soon as this pattern appeared, the person was immediately sent to the temple. And then in the temple, they pray for peace in the empire and offer a sacrifice. And in return, they receive a guarantee of wealth and honor. And God himself is pleased with the sacrifice of his chosen man. And because of that, no country dared even envy the mighty Holy Empire. It was the same 20 years ago. But at some point, the rains just stopped falling. And eventually, all rivers and lakes dried up. And crop failures continued. And many species of animals and plants disappeared, and infectious diseases raged. And the formerly abundant, beautiful empire was in an instant plunged into chaos. And then the nomad who spread the misfortune was recognized as the culprit, for she had dared to spend the night with the emperor, and she had even more dirty and greedy thoughts. So it was necessary to find the source of the misfortune and get rid of it. And as a result, after the archbishop's words, the people of the empire became very angry. As expected, the emperor blamed the nomadic girl for everything. So he ordered to search for this girl and execute her. And so one night, by the light of a bright moon, a nomadic woman flowed without memory. And she cradled the infant against her weakened body and kept running away all night long. Eventually, they were able to catch her anyway. And in the end, she was awaiting execution. And people only shouted angrily that they should have killed her mixed-blood child as well. It was after this that the nomadess uttered her curse. And she said that she had cursed the entire empire, and that this curse would haunt these people even after her death. And in the event that the blood of her innocent child spilled on this land, then the sacred empire will be destroyed, and there will be continued drought and disease, and everyone here will surely die. She was then executed, and in the end, as a result of the mother's desperate curse, she was able to save her child. And the girl's father, the emperor, locked his daughter in a damp attic following the temple's instructions. And a lock was hung to seal the cursed blood. But even after that, the drought continued and the man chosen by the gods did not show up. And then it became obvious to everyone that the Trump Empire would never be rich again. At that moment, the girl looking at her bread thought that it was unlikely that she would be able to eat more than that, but she wondered how old the bread was. But the next moment she touched her mark and called Aqua. And at that moment, everything shone brightly around her. And turning to her, the light inquired why the mistress had called him. And she calmly looked him over and told him that she needed to moisten her throat a bit and wondered if Aqua could help her with that. And then the light shone a little brighter, informed him that if this was the order of the protagonist, he would certainly create as much water as the mistress would like. And then looking at this light, the girl stated that she got a lot of things thanks to Aqua. But the next moment, approaching the girl's hands, Aqua started to create water, and the protagonist thought that every time she thought it was amazing. She smiled gratefully and thanked Aqua for her help, and began to think about how the Empire's drought had gotten worse. And soon these people would be willing to go anywhere to find a source of water. This is the kind of situation where the protagonist could be the best sacrifice. And all this time she's been carefully pretending to be insane. So it's likely that these people would think that she could just be used and not be a problem. But that's not what happened. But the next moment when the girl drank the water, she thought that now she felt a little more alive, which pleased her immensely. And mentally, she wished that the Empire would suffer a little more drought, for this drought would be a precious opportunity for her. As a result, at night, the protagonist fell into a dream, and in her dream, she saw all those events that happened to her mother. And she stood among the cheering crowd that was so eager for the death of her mother and shouted slogans that this witch was finally executed. And then the woman used her last moment to turn to her daughter and stated that her daughter was a very beautiful but unhappy child, but she loved her dearly. Then her life was cut short, and the protagonist looked in horror at her severed head and had no strength to bear such a horrible sight. Eventually, at this moment, Osiria woke up from her nightmare and leaned her back against the wall, trying to come to her senses, and stated that she had this dream every time she started to forget it even a little bit. And it pained her to realize that in order to protect her child, her mother had undoubtedly taken all her sins upon herself. And she had spent her last desperate moment before the cheering people of the whole empire. And thinking about it, Osiria realized that even though she had watched this scene countless times, this scene seemed more and more sad each time. And it was truly unbearable. And about the same time, people gathered in front of the emperor, desperately asking him to make some decision, because for 3 years the empire had not seen even a drop of rain, and the population was already down by a quarter, so they needed to get their hands on a water source by any means necessary. But he only rubbed his throbbing head unhappily, thinking that apparently the prayer they had read last time in the temple had been useless, and didn't know what to do. But at that moment he was approached by a man who asked if the emperor would be willing to send the princess to another kingdom, in which case they could make a treaty and import water from there for a sufficiently long period of time. But he only grudgingly said that something like this would hurt his pride. Then he looked around at everyone present and asked in a disgruntled manner, did he, the emperor of this country, have to bow his head to some kingdom? And then everyone present froze in horror and did not know what to say to him. But the silence was broken by another man, who said that the archbishop was also in favor of the proposal. And besides, as soon as they managed to establish the water supply, they would increase their military power and easily restore the status of the empire. And then, thinking about the man's words, the emperor thought that if the archbishop himself was not against such an idea, there would be trouble. And if he bowed just once and could get water at a cheap price for a long time, it would be a chance to get rid of the headache for a long time. So if they successfully resolved this issue, things could be in their favor. Because up until now, they had only let the princess live because of the nomad curse. And they couldn't abandon her because they were afraid that this girl might die somewhere in their territory. But then the emperor said that their princess intelligence was on the level of a small child, and he didn't understand why they would send such a deranged princess. But at that moment, the man bowed to him and declared that they would be sure to train the princess so that she would speak as little as possible, for though she is evil. But the princess took after her mother's looks and looked good. So if she is trained in intimate affairs, she can be suitable as a concubine. And at this moment, listening to such words, the emperor only thought that he would insanely like to go back 20 years to the time when he embraced that despicable nomadic woman who had put a curse on them. But after pulling himself together, he looked around at those present and said that in that case they had to make an agreement with the kingdom and train the princess so that she would be as useful as possible. Then he demanded that the search for the man chosen by the gods be accelerated. He also demanded that everyone contact the temple and ordered that prayers not be interrupted, and also to raise the tax, for it was necessary to harvest the crops and give the best of them as a sacrifice. In the end, at about the same time, the tower where the protagonist was imprisoned was being visited by maids, and when the protagonist heard this sound, she thought that it was not yet time for them to come. But in the next few moments, they opened the door with determination and went straight for the protagonist. And as they approached, they started grabbing her by the arms to get her out. But she only looked around at them excitedly, not realizing if this was a new kind of abuse, so she demanded to be released as soon as possible. But the next moment she was slapped in the face by one of the maids, and then looked at the girl with contempt and demanded that she obediently follow them if she did not want to be beaten more severely. The maids used 2 people to take her out of the room and held her by both hands, while Osiria kept screaming that she was in pain and didn't want to go there. But at that moment, the head maid followed them down and told the other girls that they should have been a little patient, because they would not have long to look at such lowlifes, because it was going to rain soon. But when the protagonist hears about it, she is only unhappy to think that they don't deserve rain. After all, they can only have sewage pouring down on them, but nothing more than that. But at that moment, another maid asked if it would be all right if the princess heard about it. But the head maid only grudgingly informed that they could say anything they wanted, because Osiria didn't understand anything anyway. And then the madly disgruntled protagonist thought that everyone around her were really idiots, because she knew and understood everything perfectly well. In the end, when the protagonist was taken out of the tower, she was finally able to look at the sky, and looking at it, she stated that it was the first time she had seen something like this. And this sky was different from the illusion that Aqua was able to create. But she still didn't understand where the road she was being led down led to. Then she thought that the fact that she had come out of the attic only meant that her father, the emperor, had found a way to throw her out. But the next moment, the maid turned to her and told a princess that this was the room she needed to go to. And Osiria just thought that maybe she would finally get a chance to avenge all that she had experienced with her mother. But in the end, when the door opened, she saw that there was a bathtub in front of her. And so looking around the room, Osiria didn't understand what they wanted to do to her, if they even decided to wash her. But the next moment she was grabbed by her clothes, which immediately began to slide off her body, and the frightened girl tried to hold her down. But the next moment a bucket of water was suddenly poured on her, and then they grabbed her by the arm and took her into the bathroom and started to undress her. And Osiria only thought about the fact that she was in a lot of pain, and she wanted these people to get away from her as soon as possible. After that, already being in the bathroom, while she was being washed, the girl thought that water poured into her nose and mouth. And so she tried to cough in panic, but the maid holding her in place displeasedly stated that the protagonist was insanely dirty. Then grabbing her arm, I noted that Osiria had an insanely foul odor coming off of her, as well as dirty water all around her. And then looking at the other maids, wondering if Osiria wasn't a human being. But at that moment, the protagonist was madly angry, because it was the fault of those maids, who had best once a year poured a bucket of cold water on her and wiped her body with rags in order to wash her, and not her fault that she had not maintained hygiene while locked up for the rest of her life. But in the end, a little while later, the main character was dressed in a suitable outfit and brought into the room, where Irina looked at her and said that now the main character was at least a little pleasant to look at, and it wasn't so disgusting to be around. Then, with a smile, she introduced herself and said that from this day forward, she would be in charge of Osiria's education. She wondered in shock what they were going to teach her. But the moment she was about to ask something, she was immediately slapped in the face, after which a maddeningly disgruntled Irina shouted that apparently Osiria had been living really well in her dungeon before, if she was so shocked by one slap right now. After looking at her with disdain, she said that from now on, the girl was not allowed to make such sounds, because His Majesty the Emperor had personally ordered the training of the protagonist. And if she didn't do as Irina said, Osiria would definitely be punished. But the next moment when she tried to say something, she was slapped in the face again, and the woman grudgingly yelled at her, ordering her to speak normally. This all was watched by the other maids that could not contain laughter at the sight of this picture, and the protagonist only tiredly did as this woman wanted. But the next moment she looked at the other maids and ordered them to take the protagonist by the arms and move her to the bed. But all Osiria could think about was that she was going to die from the pain of how roughly they were treating her. But the next moment approaching her, Irina said that from now on the protagonist had to perfectly memorize everything Irina would tell her and not miss anything, because it was with this knowledge that such a useless and dirty girl like Osiria would become a little more valuable. So she should be grateful. Then informed her that when Osiria went to where she was supposed to be, she would have to obey. Then stated that even though Osiria was incredibly stupid, but she would teach her at least the basics, and then grabbed her leg and began to open them. But at that moment, the shocked protagonist couldn't stand it and pushed her away. And notwithstanding such behavior, Irina hit the girl, causing her nose to bleed immediately. But the disgruntled woman did not declare that the girl's training would last until the protagonist began to follow all her instructions perfectly. and informed her that if Osiria understood her, she was to lie down in her seat again. And then the protagonist only thought that when the time came for her revenge, Irina would be the one she would kill first. Then she just agreed to her terms. Eventually, night fell. And then, lying on her bed, the protagonist reflected on the fact that she now had a spacious room with a huge window, good fresh food, new clothes. So it was like being treated like cattle right before they were sold, and began to wonder if she was really going to be sold as a toy for the aristocrats. But I thought it was unlikely that she was. The emperor had a great deal of pride, and as lazy as he was to deal with someone like her, the emperor just couldn't get rid of a princess like that. So most likely she could have just been sold in the country she was going to. But I remember Irina's face. Osiria said she'd survived 20 years in a cramped attic, so compared to her agony, it would be easier to endure. But in any case, it was a necessity. But the next moment, raising her hand, the protagonist called out to Aqua. And then she immediately emerged from her mark on her hand shone with a bright light, and inquired for what reason Osiria called her out. But she only gazed at the spirit with admiration and noted that the light surrounding Aqua was even brighter. But the spirit calmly explained that it was a little easier to use the power here, since the interference from before had disappeared. And then thinking about it, Osiria remembered that when Aqua had first appeared in the attic, strange patterns had appeared around her. And perhaps the people who had kept her in that place were also trying to contain Aqua's power. Then, remembering their first meeting, Osiria stated that Aqua was a water spirit that had been with her since her early childhood. And it was Aqua who said that a spirit like Aqua was born to fulfill the desires and protect God's chosen one. But distract her from her musings, Aqua noted that her mistress Wand had reappeared and wondered if she should do something. But the protagonist calmly assured the spirit that everything was fine, but asked that Aqua tell her a little of what had happened. And then she began to remember that it was Aqua who had previously told her many things. It was from the water spirit that she learned about this country and her situation and her mother, who had met a terrible death. And also Aqua had told her about revenge, and it was from then that Osiria realized what she was supposed to be aiming for. But at that moment, the water spirit explained that Osiria was going to be sent to another kingdom as a concubine, and in return, they planned to negotiate cheap imports of water and food. And then thinking about it, the protagonist realized that she was being sold after all, though she was still surprised. Then she asked Aqua to tell her a little about the kingdom. And then she activated the portal and said that the view the protagonist was looking at was the capital of the Water Kingdom. And at that moment, Osiria looked around at the place and the children playing there and the cheerful people, and realized that although this kingdom seemed like a good place from the outside, the people there were just as disgusting as here. They had agreed to take her as a slave. But after Aqua suggested that tomorrow the dreadful maid would return, she could kill her. But Osiria calmly explained to Aqua that she could not do that yet. After all, the most important thing was to fulfill their revenge. And then, thinking about the main character's words, Aqua stated that she was right, and they really needed to wait a bit to make the most informed decision possible. And they had to wait for the moment when the Empire would let go of God's hand on its own. In the end, after a while, the protagonist was riding amidst a limitless sky, as well as many mountains, and there was a really beautiful view. However, now the protagonist absolutely did not pay attention to him, because she never even thought that her move will last a whole month. And she felt really awful. She had been very sick in the carriage, but she thought that sickness in a carriage was better than sickness in a ship. And certainly such a feeling was many times better than her disgusting training, because every day the protagonist washed her body and put on luxurious clothes, and then was subjected to torturous abuse. And these people really knew how to break a man down. For the first time, she was inside a huge fear and sense of shame, and felt that all she wanted to do was just end her existence as soon as possible. But she was able to endure such an ordeal, and that when she left the Empire on her own, another chosen one would probably be born, and it looks like she gave the Empire a chance for rebirth with her own hands. So she reflected on the fact that this should not have happened, and she was bound to be rewarded for her torment. And for that, these people have to surrender. So the girl, remembering all her past, was really determined to destroy the Holy Empire, which had long forgotten about its sanctity. But at that moment, while the protagonist was suffering from nausea, she was approached by Aqua, who inquired about her mistress and excitedly informed her that she could easily kill everyone here if ordered to. But Osiria only thought about how many times Aqua had already made her a similar offer, but then thought about how she really would have liked to kill all the people around her, but she should have been patient. After which she held her hands out closer to Aqua and informed her that a complete break with the Empire was just the beginning, for she was to grow an overwhelming force and make it rain all over the world. And she will surely cover the skies with the showers that will come in the Empire, but it will all be in other countries as a mockery of the Holy Empire. And at that moment, she will actually end the existence of this empire with her own hands. But the next moment, distracted from thinking about her plan, she noticed the view outside the window. So looking around, she turned to Aqua and suggested that she also look at the view of the royal castle. And then looking around the place, the water spirits stated that they would really come soon. And then the protagonist could be free. And then looking at such views, Osiria stated that this place looked beautiful. After all, the empire in which she lived seemed only outwardly beautiful, but it was a hell for her. In the end, after a while, the protagonist reached, and getting out of the carriage, she was thinking only about how she could find a way not to die now. After all, she really felt terrible. But in the end, she mentally calmed herself and realized that she had to be strong now. So she continued to walk further down the royal halls. And all the while, Osiria was thinking that this was the place where her future would be decided. It was said that hostages were usually presented to the king as a gift. So she wondered if she would be a gift to his majesty. But at that moment, she entered the hall where the king was and thought only that it would be best to get into the hands of someone she would not have to see often. Then she began to look behind the backs of the people who had come with her and thought that the king should be right in front of her now. But she could see nothing, though she tried to see his majesty. But at that moment, Irina pinched her arm, ordering her to stand still. And she only grudgingly thought about the fact that Irina would probably behave so disgustingly until the end. But at that moment, the king looked around at everyone present and told them that they had come a long and difficult way from the empire. So he suggested that they start by sitting down. But the excited men looked around him and asked where the king wanted them to sit, for they saw no chairs or armchairs anywhere. But he calmly explained that the answer to that question was obvious enough, because they should sit where they had just stood, implying that they should sit on the floor. And then the insanely displeased men only stated that it was very rude indeed, and inquired of the king whether he had absolutely no respect for the delegation of the empire. But looking at all the arrivals with a soft but no less wicked smile, stated that there was hardly anything for which to humiliate their empire, and informed them that it was a greeting used only in their country. And then the king, looking at the maddeningly displeased man, asked if the delegation of the empire did not respect the existing traditions in their kingdom. And then, however displeased the man was, he sat down on the floor and said that they accepted the king's friendly proposal and apologized for such rudeness. But the protagonist only looked around calmly and thought that everyone around her was just idiots. After all, it was time to realize that the empire wasn't as respected as it used to be. But at that moment, Osiria was approached by the king, who asked her to come forward. And then he looked at her carefully and stated that the status of the empire had apparently fallen a lot, because even if they had a water problem, it was very strange to send their princess as a concubine. Then smiled and stated that it was impossible to do that, even if she was insanely stupid. And at that moment, the protagonist shook with panic and thought that if the situation was already coming out like this, she needed to pretend to be a little more stupid than he expected. After all, if the king found out that the girl was a complete idiot, he would stop being interested in her himself. But at that moment, Irina spoke to the king and excitedly informed him that they knew what the king was so worried about, but explained that Princess Osiria was more beautiful than any woman in their empire. But because of one incident, the girl is a bit dumbed down, but still continues to learn quickly. And they trained the girl so that the princess would not inconvenience the king in any way. But listening to all this, the protagonist only thought about the fact that every word of Irina was a complete lie. After all, they can't say that as the princess of the empire went crazy because they left her locked up since childhood. But at this moment, bowing to the king, the man explained that because of the long-standing trade relationship, His Majesty the Emperor said that he would hand over their precious princess to the king as a friendly gesture, so they would be grateful if the king would accept the girl without too much worry. But the king only wondered with a smile what the emperor meant by making such a friendly gesture. And at that moment, looking at him, the protagonist wondered why the king had such a reaction, and thought that in all likelihood the king just didn't like her, but she certainly didn't like it, because she had to stay in this place by all means. So resolutely she raised her head and looked at the man and wondered what she could do to stay here. But faced with his unusual piercing gaze, which was so hard to deal with that she immediately lowered her head and noticed that the mark on her arm had begun to glow under her clothes, and Osiria became excited thinking about the fact that the pattern that was on her arm was not supposed to be seen by other people, but she had the impression that the king was able to see it. But at that moment, seeing her anxiety, the king, turning to the princess of Osiria, asked her to raise her head and look at her. And the girl realized that this was the first person about whom she felt such unusual excitement. But she was troubled by the thought that perhaps the king was no ordinary man. And the protagonist couldn't stop thinking about the fact that being near this king gave her a very strange sensation. And even now it seemed as if her whole body was in pain. But at this moment, while the princess was in her reflections, Irina approached her unhappily and informed the girl that she was to follow the order as soon as possible and raise her head and do as she had been taught. And then the protagonist slowly reared her head and wondered what Irina had taught her to say something like that, because all she had taught her was to tell men that she understood and to do whatever they told her to do. But eventually she looked up and looked back at the king and thought that she should have continued to do things the way she had been doing them to begin with. And then the king looked around Osiria with a smile and asked the delegation what the empire needed, because earlier they had said they only needed food and water supplies. But the frantic man said they had requested the exchange as a sign of friendship between the two countries. But the king only gave them a silly look and said that he understood what they wanted, but he still had a question as to why they had sent him this princess, and whether the emperor had led a dissolute life, and he had many children. So giving up his daughter was not any trouble at all. But at that moment, the insanely disgruntled representatives of the delegation excitedly asked the king how he could say something like that about their emperor, and they were worried about what the king meant by his debauched lifestyle. But at this moment, the protagonist only thought about the fact that these words were addressed to her, and it was as if the king wanted to say that without her, the problems of the empire would have been solved, but thought maybe she was imagining things. But she could not figure out what the king was going to do with her. But at that moment, he said with a smile that the term suited him, and they were to tell their emperor that he would accept the princess with great gratitude. After which he stated with the same smile that if the matter had already been settled, they should now consider how best to deal with the princess. After that, he called his knight closer, and then looking at the knight bowing before him, the king said that from now on it was Fidelius who would look after Princess Osiria, because there was no suitable place in the castle for the princess. And then everyone got excited and wondered what the king was saying, and how it was possible to tell such lies. And everyone realized that every time this king said anything, he was blatantly lying. It was hard to believe that in the whole spacious castle, there was not a single place where the protagonist could stop. But at that moment, the knight Fidelius bowed before the king and said that apparently he was too unintelligent, so he did not understand the meaning of the king's order. But he calmly informed that it was his gift, since Fidelius had refused all the rewards offered to him previously. And so he felt that taking the princess as a gift was the best decision for him. And the protagonist awkwardly wondered if that was a good option, because either way, the king doesn't look like he was going to send her back. Then looking over her delegation, Osiria thought it was quite obvious why the king of this country behaves like this here and now, for he intends to give his subordinate the gift that has arrived, thereby muddying the pride of the empire, and thus wants to show the empire its place. At this moment, as expected, the excited men immediately began to discuss how on earth the king dared to hand over an imperial gift right in front of the delegation. And they didn't know how the king might feel about their empire. But then they realized it was all because the empire stopped reigning because of one damned girl, and now they had to endure the same treatment from other countries. But the protagonist only grudgingly reflected on the fact that not so long ago they were shifting all the blame onto the powerless nomad. And after her death, her daughter was accused of all the sins. But she realized that they could talk about it as much as they wanted, because in any case, the girl already knew what end awaited them all. But at that moment, distracting her from her musings, the king turned to Fidelius and asked if the knight would accept the gift, for it was his show of concern for his servant, and he wanted Fidelius to take a renewed interest in girls. But he only calmly informed him that he would in any case obey the order of His Highness the King. And hearing this, the ruler himself looked at him with a smile and was glad that Fidelius had decided to accept such a gift. And looking around at all the arrivals, said that he thought Princess Osiria would be perfect for his knight. So he hoped that none of the newcomers were offended. And the protagonist just thought it was cruel to make her knight interested in a crazy princess, and thought that maybe the king just hated his knight. But at that moment, His Majesty's gaze became much more serious and informed that if anyone was not satisfied with his choice, they could limit themselves to the rest of the gifts that the emperor had given, and they could take the princess back. And at this point, after hearing this, a shocked Osiria only wondered why this king was always playing with people, but thought that such a thing should not happen, for the empire would not like to take her back either, as they hated her and tried with all their might to get rid of her. But at the same time, they could only take her away because of their pride. So she felt very excited. But one of the men who had arrived bent down to inform her that Princess Osiris had been given to them as a token of friendship, so the king could dispose of his gift as he wished. And he just looked at them with a smile and thanked them for their understanding, and said that he had prepared a banquet for the arrivals. So he asked all the members of the delegation to have fun before they left, and they just stammered their thanks to the king and started walking away. And at that moment, the protagonist was finally left without their influence, and thought that she was insanely glad that she had been abandoned, because now the shackles that had been imposed on her have completely broken. And by doing so, it would not be long before the empire would finally lose its divine power, for they had lowered God's hand on their own. But unexpectedly for the princess, the king turned to his knight and informed him that he could now take the princess, and he could be completely free for the day. And then he rose from his seat and thanked His Majesty the king, and said that he would do his bidding. And the protagonist only looked at him excitedly, completely forgetting that he was here to stay. She thought that maybe she should have called Aqua to help her get out of here, but realized that if she hurried and revealed her true identity, she would be captured quickly. But the next moment, the guide approached her, carefully bowed so that I wouldn't scare her. Then holding out his hand, asked Princess Osiria if she could rise from her seat. But the protagonist just looked him over and wondered what was happening to her. After all, this guy scared her so badly. She also didn't understand why Fidelius treated her with such respect. But afterwards, when the guy saw that the protagonist didn't react, he apologized and lifted her up in his arms. And the agitated Osiria huddled closer to him, thinking that it was very sudden, and didn't understand why he was acting like that. But at that moment, Fidelius looked at His Majesty the king and said that in that case, they should have been the first to leave. And after bidding farewell to the king, he began to leave the throne room. And the girl was embarrassed by such a thing, and thought about the fact that she was so much surprised by the actions of this knight that she almost screamed. And looking at the king that was left behind, she thought about the fact that once she got out of this place, she would have to find out more about this man, and realized that Aqua had to know something about this man. But at that moment, he whispered something with a smile while addressing the main character, and she shockingly literally couldn't believe what he was asking her, because even though the king didn't make a sound, but there could be no mistake, and he had asked Osiria if she had gotten what she wanted. And after these words, the protagonist was sure that the king knew from the beginning that she was all right, and thought about the fact that a kingdom is a country that has received the blessing of water. And perhaps if this man was a king, he was powerful enough to see her mark that was hidden from the view of others. Then she thought that even the color of this man's eyes reminded her of Aqua's radiance, and admitted to herself that even though they had only met for a moment, her body still trembled at the memory of it. And then panic, wondering if she should kill this king, or perhaps she should ask Aqua to kill him. After all, the most effective way for her to survive was to destroy the enemy. However, it seemed to her that she couldn't kill this man at all. But after Fidelius noticed that she was trembling, he pulled her closer to him. And looking at the guy, Osiria wondered if this man would be all right. Even though he had to carry the crazy girl in his arms, he didn't seem to be angry at all. And then the girl relaxed a little, thinking that it was the first time anyone had ever hugged her, and was embarrassed to realize that this was exactly what it felt like to be hugged by a human. As a result, a little later, when the girl was already in the carriage, Fidelius approached her, who excitedly asked Her Highness if she had felt any discomfort while traveling here. But a flustered and tense Osiria only wondered if the knight was being too polite to her, especially since in all her life in the Empire, she had never once heard such polite treatment. And so she asked the man to leave a little frightened because she didn't like him. But at that moment, the madly shocked guy looked at her and didn't know what to do. Then carefully climbed into the carriage and looking at the girl wondered, is he really scares her so much? But the protagonist looked at the knight, thought, is this guy is not going to be angry with her at all, and did not know why he behaves like this. Because everything was very strange for her, because the main character realized that she was literally the perfect punching bag, and that's why it was strange that Fidelius treated her so respectfully. which made her feel uncomfortable. So she excitedly yelled to the guy that she wanted to go home and asked Fidelis to let her go. But the next moment, she excitedly noticed the guy raising his hand above her, and so she was already expecting the blow that was to follow. But instead, the guy only gently placed his palm on the protagonist's hand and asked the girl not to make such sudden movements. After all, the seat in this carriage was hard, so she could hurt herself. Then, taking her palm gently, he told her that Osiris had probably had a hard time getting to this place and suggested that they go to his house first. But the protagonist, or fearfully looking around him, wondered, does Fidelis really expect her to believe his foolish acting? Followed by a mental apologizing to him that she ideally possessed the ability to pretend and knew perfectly well that she must not let her guard down. For the farther she went, the more carefully she had to conceal her dreams and her appearance. And so she smiled happily and told Fidelis that she wanted to go home and she liked it there. After which she looked back at the knight's shocked face and reflected that his kindness was not without reason. And there was no way she should believe in such a display of good-naturedness. And so to prevent anyone from discovering her true intent, she had to pretend to be a stupid child who'd been ignored for so long. Then the girl looked around the window and thought about the fact that in this world, there are no entirely good people, only people with good patience. But when she looked at Fidelis across from her, she realized that apparently the man had good patience. So probably, unless he was very annoyed, he wouldn't hit her. But she still realized she should be as careful as possible, since Aqua had said earlier that quiet people were insanely scary in anger. In the end, it was not unnoticed from Fidelis that the protagonist was trembling madly, and it seems that she was very ill from this trip. So he turned to her and asked her if she was all right, for she looked as if she had been seasick. But she could not answer intelligibly, and just looked at him with the most tired look possible. And then Fidelis rose from his seat and moved closer to Osiris, apologizing in advance, saying that what he wanted to do wouldn't take long. After that, he put his hand behind her back, and then the mad, frightened protagonist, looking at him, immediately began to apologize and say that she was very wrong, and her voice was shaking with fear. But to her surprise, all the man did was loosen the ties on her corset a bit, and carefully, so as not to embarrass the protagonist, asked if Osiris was feeling a little better. He explained that he had thought from the beginning that her feeling was due to the uncomfortable clothes. Then he looked at her carefully and asked her to lean on the other side of the carriage to make her feel a little better, then asked her to give him her hand and began gently rubbing her fingers. But the insanely frightened protagonist immediately began screaming and trying to wrench her hand away, saying she was in insane pain. But the agitated guy tried to explain that it wasn't really pain she was feeling, but the girl absolutely wouldn't listen to him, after which she excitedly cried. Then Fidelis gently released her hand and told her that the girl was very seasick, so he suggested to her to walk a little and asked if she would mind it. And the protagonist only looked at him in surprise and thought that Fidelis must have been an insanely stupid man, because he was trying to talk to a girl who didn't understand words. Then she remembered that no one had asked her anything until now, because it was silly to be interested in the opinion of someone you couldn't even talk to. It was a waste of time. But at the same time, Fidelis didn't look so stupid as not to understand such obvious things. And maybe he just wanted to test her. So the protagonist carefully flew off, childishly asking him what he meant when talking on foot. And he calmly explained that it wasn't that long of a walk from here to his house, so you could get there using your feet. And the protagonist awkwardly reflected on that suggestion and said that she would go on foot. And she reflected that it would be well enough in any case if she could get off the carriage in peace. In the end, when the protagonist together with Fidelis came to his house, the girl immediately excitedly ran a maid who said that now she unfortunately had an insanely urgent matter, so she needed to step away for a while, but afterward informed her that if she had the chance, she would like to talk a little longer with Osiris, and she would like to show her around the place, and wondered if the girl would mind if she did a little later. Then led her into the room and informed Osiris that if she needed anything, she could just ring the bell, and wondered if the protagonist understood her. Then she was about to leave, but at the last moment she smiled brightly at the protagonist and promised that she would be back soon, and asked the girl to rest. But as soon as the door closed behind the maid, the maddeningly disgruntled Osiris wondered what this child was even doing next to her, and realized that she was starting to get a lot of noise in her head from all the noise. Then she looked around and thought that Aqua had once told her that people should socialize with people like them. But even if that was true, she hadn't expected that everyone in this place would end up being so kind. But remembering the young man, she realized that as time went on, people were bound to reveal their true intentions. Whereupon it recalled the king, who seemed to her still the most suspicious of them all. But eventually, she calmed down a bit. The girl sat down on the bed and then called out to Aqua. And then her hand shone brightly and Aqua slowly started to come out of it. But in the next moment, when the spirit of water finally appeared, the protagonist, in shock, looking at her, literally couldn't believe that Aqua looked like that. But the spirit calmly and with a smile explained that she was indeed Aqua, and thanks to the move to the overflowing water energy kingdom, Aqua was finally able to regain her true form. Madly surprised, the protagonist looked over at Aqua and stated that she hadn't even expected Aqua to be a boy all along. But the spirit calmly explained that she didn't really have any gender, and therefore it didn't matter how she was addressed. And the protagonist only looked at the spirit with embarrassment, thinking that this water spirit was indeed insanely cute. But at this time, Aqua said that Osiria should probably feel pretty good about herself now that her connection to the Empire had finally been severed. But the protagonist only smiled at the fact that she had never imagined that she would be so happy about some sense of freedom. After all, now all that was left was to get out of this place. But to her surprise, Aqua flew closer to her and asked her why the protagonist wanted to leave. But she calmly explained that she didn't like that she was sold to this country. So here she still can't be free. But the water spirit calmly explained that if that was the problem, she could just ask the king of this country for something like that. But Osiria, madly surprised by her suggestion, only wondered if Aqua somehow knew the king, after which she reported that earlier she had a feeling that the king had seen her hidden pattern where Aqua was. And so she also felt that the king had been able to expose her behavior, and so it could be dangerous. But a little awkwardly, Aqua said that everything was supposed to go well, and it was unlikely that the king wanted to harm her. But the main character only grudgingly inquired what Aqua had meant. But she kept changing the subject, and Osiria was surprised because up until now, the water spirit had clearly answered all her questions, and so she didn't understand what had suddenly changed. But when she realized that for some reason the introductory spirit just didn't want to discuss it with her, she calmly informed him that she wouldn't want to ask for help from such a suspicious king anyway. After all, she subconsciously didn't like him in some way. And then a slightly downcast and sad Aqua informed her that since the protagonist had spoken in such a manner, she was simply obliged to follow her wishes, but asked that Osiria still admit at least to herself that this queen was the best place to be. Then literally glowing reported that in addition, since the first meeting with that knight, Aqua did not feel any bad energy from him, and the protagonist thought sadly that she realized it. And for that very reason, she felt very bad. For it would have been much more usual and better for her if Fidelius had simply communicated with her as carelessly as other people had previously communicated with her. But at that moment, Aqua suddenly approached her and gently hugged her head and told her that now it seemed to her that Osiria should not have pretended. After all, she had sacrificed so much until now. And so now the water spirit really wanted her mistress to live the life she wanted, for she was truly worthy of more, and could not deceive anyone and just live in peace and happiness, surrounded by affection and care, and told the protagonist that she had been the god's favorite since she was born. And the protagonist just covered her eyes and thought that those were insanely warm and nice words. And they also felt like soft feathers were enveloping her heart, and she wished she could really do as the water spirit said. But the next moment, everything inside her shrank, for she heard some maddeningly loud sound, as if something had fallen on the floor. And so she turned around excitedly, but what she saw was the same nightmare that haunted her all the time, namely her mother's head. And looking at this picture, she remembered every time her last words to her daughter. And so pressing her lips tightly together to keep from screaming, the protagonist tried to calm the shivers through her body and told the water spirit that she really didn't need all the things Aqua had told her about, because all she needed was her water spirit. Then she thought that these conversations were indeed like a dream, but they should remain just that, a dream. After all, she had important things left to do. Then the protagonist said that she was going to stay in this place for a while to begin with, and that she should therefore continue to act like a child. But the surprised Aqua only wondered why the protagonist wanted to do that. But she awkwardly informed that everyone would be very confused if a mediocrity like her suddenly started acting like an adult. And Aqua realized that people are apparently more complicated than she expected. And the main character, when she looked at her thought process, realized that she had the impression that Aqua was much more human than she was. And at this point, thoughtfully, Aquapo inquired, is it really considered something strange if a person suddenly grows up? But when the protagonist reported that it was, the madly joyful spirit came closer and hugged the protagonist and said that in this case, everything is very simple to solve. The protagonist should just grow gradually, in the same way that Aqua herself had grown earlier. After all, she was originally just light. And then thinking about her words, the protagonist realized that it would be just like when she was a little girl with the power of the water spirit to look at the world and learn. And apparently, Aqua meant that she should also gradually reveal her knowledge to other people. And so pondering the spirit's suggestion said that although it would take some time, it was really not a bad way to go. But after looking at Aqua carefully, she wondered if she still had anything to say about the king of this country. But seeing his agitation, she realized that Aqua would probably continue to hide something. But in the next moment, as a rescue for Aqua and as the prize for the protagonist, the maid approached her. And so the excited girl did not know what to do. But taking this opportunity, the spirit immediately informed the protagonist that if someone came, she had to quickly return to the pattern, especially since she was very tired after such a long conversation. And the heroine was just thinking about the fact that she's obviously in trouble now because she didn't notice it herself and she was talking too loudly. And she was worried that the maid wouldn't overhear. But at that moment, a girl suddenly approached her who slightly embraced the main character and apologized for her long absence. And then the girl, in shock, looking at her so sweet and radiant face, literally could not believe that a person could be so kind. So I'm shocked to think that this girl was probably raised by good people and never bullied. But at that moment, the excited maid explained to the protagonist that she had previously touched other objects with her hands, and therefore she must not touch her mouth with her hands because she might get sick. And then she carefully wiped her hands with a cloth. And then the protagonist, looking at her work, wondered if it was really impossible to touch anything. But at that moment, as soon as the maid heard the voice of the protagonist, she immediately smiled happily and praised the princess, and said that she was really right and she shouldn't do that. And then she introduced herself. This girl's name was Maria, and she asked the protagonist to call her by that name in the future. But at that moment, I wondered in shock if Maria had been talking to her so curtly all this time because she was worried that she might not understand her. And I wondered if it really looked very funny from the outside. Then, looking at her face, which was shining with happiness, she could not understand what the girl wanted from her and thought that Maria must be waiting for her to call her by name. And in the end, when she did, Maria happily hugged the protagonist and informed her that she was indeed Maria, who would be by the protagonist's side all the time. And the maid looked insanely happy. But the insanely disgruntled Osiria only thought about the fact that she didn't understand why such strange people had gathered in this place. I ended up sitting at the table at about the same time Fidelius was sitting with an older young man. And then Fidelius carefully thanked the man at the table for agreeing to such an unexpected visit. But he calmly looked at his tea and stated that the knight should not thank him for such a thing, because he was now in the house of the knight Fidelius, to which it was insanely difficult to get an invitation. He could not refuse when he had a rare opportunity to drink such expensive tea. Then, scrutinizing the young man, he stated that apparently something had happened that the knights had a hard time dealing with, and suggested that it must have had something to do with the princess of the empire who arrived recently. And hearing his assumption, the young man awkwardly reflected that conversation with strangers always made him uneasy. However, he now desperately needed the help of the elder who stood almost at the very head of the royal palace. And so he awkwardly said that the men must have already seen the condition in which the princess had arrived. But the healer calmly stated that Osiria looked like a small child. Then, looking carefully at the young man, he noticed that he was most concerned with how depressed the protagonist looked, because there is a high probability that she grew up in the wrong environment, and seeing the incomprehension on the young man's face explained that there had been some bad rumors about the princess for a long time, and he had also been able to find out information that had been circulated while discussing the princess' arrival as a friendly gesture. And the rumors were that Osiria was considered cursed in the empire and hated by the entire homeland. And then, thinking about it, Fidelius realized that apparently the empire was claiming that the princess was the cause of all disasters, and they had made the incomprehensible and powerless girl a shield. And he was disgusted by the thought. But then the man told Fidelius that the empire had always relied on God alone. And so it was that when they had no one else to blame, their anger turned to the princess. So he was madly sorry that Princess Osyria had become a sacrificial sheep without even realizing it. And then awkwardly Fidelius assented to his words, whereupon the mendicant informed him that His Majesty had previously intended to refuse such a friendly present. And Fidelius calmly confirmed his words, but said that suddenly the king had changed his mind and accepted the princess, as well as the empire's demands. But he could not understand what had made the man change his mind, and then stated that although His Majesty loved fun, he also cared more for his people than anyone else, and didn't understand why he'd accepted the princess. And Fidelius could not understand the reason why His Majesty had given the girl to him, for the king should have known better than anyone that Fidelius was very bad with people, especially women and small children. But the next moment an idea came into his head, and he reflected that apparently the king wanted to see how desperate the young man would be when he realized his powerlessness. And so, in desperation, turned to the man sitting across from him and inquired if there was any chance that the princess could return to her original state, and added that Osyria was frightened even when she simply bumped into him with her eyes, and admitted to the healer that she had asked him about such a thing because if Osyria understood any words, perhaps she would be a little less wary of him, after which he thought that from now on the princess would live in the house, and there would be a lot of trouble if the girl continued to be so afraid of him. And then the healer listened to him carefully and said that he understood the reasons why Fidelius had called him. And the boy calmly explained that as a healer, the man had to understand how to deal with mentally ill people. But the healer looked at Fidelius carefully and said that in that case, he had a solution to the situation. After all, Fidelius could just try to teach the girl to speak. It wasn't hard enough. After all, if the princess's development stopped at the level of a small child simply because of shock or the environment, he wouldn't be able to cure her with any medicine. But if the girl will hear a lot of different words and sentences, as well as feel a variety of bright emotions, then maybe she will feel better in everyday life. And then madly agitated Fidelius thought about what the physician had told him. After all day he had only spoken when he answered His Majesty's questions, and gave orders to the knights during training. And he did not understand how he could even teach this girl to speak. And then scrutinizing the knight, the healer thought about the fact that the guy was indeed known for his taciturnity. And in that case, it was most likely not going to be a very easy task for him. Then the physician informed the knight that although he could not read His Majesty the king's mind with his narrow knowledge, he was sure that there were reasons why the king could not do otherwise. And the insanely excited young man only had the thought of their king wanted embarrassing him in his head. And it would have been much easier if it was about ball possession, but he just didn't see how he could deal with the protagonist. Then I remembered that when he picked her up, it was hard to believe she had such a light body. She was as thin as a fallen branch and as light as a piece of paper, and he had never met such a man in his life. But after calmly looking over the healer, the knight said that he would rather order Maria and Pedro to take charge of her training, for the princess evidently liked these young men much better. Well, at that moment, the healer calmly said that of course Fidelius could do as he pleased, but the lad must not forget his position as a knight. And though the girl was in a terrible state, she was still a princess on the other side, and excessive interest and unnecessary displays of affection for her would soon become poison to her. She added that if war with the empire broke out, the princess would be the person Fidelius would have to kill first. But he just thought about this picture and calmly told the healer that he understood what he was talking about, and he would definitely remember his instruction. Eventually, a little while later, Maria came into the protagonist's room and smiling happily announced that she had brought the princess some food. Then tried to feed the girl and displeased, almost crying, informed the protagonist that he cannot be so fastidious. Otherwise, Maria will start to be very sad. Then constantly around her and also offered to wash, and said that she had taken care of the temperature of the water and wondered if the princess had anything she wanted to ask for. And the protagonist only grudgingly thought that with such care she was sure to go mad soon, for it seemed that her head was insanely full of this girl's eternal talk. In the end, a little later, while in the bathroom, the protagonist was thinking that apparently Maria wanted her to call her by her first name, and apparently she liked it very much. Afterwards, she thought that it must have been really nice. After all, no one had ever called her by her name. And so, unfortunately, she couldn't understand how Maria felt. But after a while the girl was gently going through and rinsing her hair, Osyria reflected that it was a really nice and warm feeling. But at that moment, Maria informed the protagonist with a smile that a little later, before she was to have dinner, the host, meaning Fidelius, was to come, and the protagonist only grudgingly thought about the fact that she was madly eager to see Aqua, and did not understand when all these people would leave her alone. At this time, a young man was already walking towards her, together with the healer. As a result, a little later, a healer came to her and bowed before the protagonist and told the girl that he was an employee of the royal palace. And then the protagonist excitedly bowed and, still playing her part, asked what healer meant. And the man calmly explained that these are the people who treat other people, and then asked the protagonist to give him her hand for a moment. But she was only excitedly wondering why the man wanted her hand, and worried that he might sense her mark. But at that moment, Aqua's voice entered her head, and the spirit immediately told the girl not to be so frightened, and told her that because they were in a powerful enough place, she would now be able to talk to the main character inside her mind, and told the protagonist that only a person with God's pattern could borrow God's power. And then the protagonist thought about what Aqua's words had said and calmed down a bit, and she realized that no one would be able to see the mark. Then she gave her hand to the healer, and the healer looked at her carefully and asked her what she usually liked to eat. And then the protagonist said with a smile that she didn't really like hard bread, but she did like sweets. But hearing this innocent phrase, the knight was wildly furious, and the healer just looked down with great sadness. And the protagonist clearly noticed the change in atmosphere, and so looking around at the men in front of her wondered what she had said or done wrong, and couldn't help but realize what the problem was. As a result, a little later, while clearing the plates from the table after dinner, Maria told the princess that she would be back soon and asked her to spend some time alone. And the protagonist even looked closely at the girl and asked that Maria return as soon as possible. But when Osiria called her name, the girl could not stand it. She immediately ran up and hugged the princess tightly and promised that she would be back soon. But the girl herself only grudgingly thought that the maid hugged her so tightly that she literally could not breathe. In the end, a little time later, the protagonist was left alone and thought that she could finally have a little break from so many people, and thought that such attention is really a burden for her. And then, holding out her hand, immediately called out to Aqua. And then the water spirit started to come out, but at that moment, the protagonist violently grabbed the spirit and immediately suggested that she and Aqua run away from here. But the aquatic spirit was only agitated, asked what reason they had to leave so suddenly. But Osiria calmly explained that no matter how hard they tried, she still couldn't get used to the people that were here. And hearing something like that, Aqua wondered if it was because everyone was nice and kind to her. But the protagonist only awkwardly averted her gaze and said that she didn't care how they behaved towards her. She didn't care about that at all, but thought about the fact that she was starting to feel uncomfortable because she was pretending to be a little child in front of these people and deceived them, even though they were very nice. But after forcing herself to calm down, she told Aqua that what was important was that she had other things to do now, because she had to get away from this place and take all the remaining water from the empire, and told Aqua that they had their purpose. Because first, they had to drain the rivers and lakes that Aqua had kept untouched all this time, for the sake of the protagonist's life. And then she must go around the village near the empire and reveal her true identity to them, and at the appointed time cause it to rain. And then rumors would begin to spread, and the entire empire would know about her. And then the empire would be cornered. She looked at the water spirit with seriousness and suggested that they carry out their plan as soon as possible. But Aqua calmly informed the girl that there were a lot of guards outside, and if she went out, she'd be caught. And then, looking out the window and convinced by Aqua's words, the protagonist wondered if there was nothing they could do about it. But the spirit calmly informed that with the help of divine power, she could walk on water, to which Osiria calmly remarked that it would be too conspicuous, and she didn't think such a thing would be insanely helpful in escaping. And then Aqua said that in that case, the water could do anything. For example, if the protagonist jumped into the water, she could move to another place where there was also water. But she thought about the fact that there was no such amount of water in this room, and therefore another way was needed. And then, excitedly flying nearby, said that in that case, they could make the main character wings out of water. And with these wings, the girl could fly through the sky. But she was excited to look at the water spirit and wondered if such a thing could really be made of water. But Aqua calmly touched her hand and said that there was no object that Aqua could not make out of water, and then added that most of the things that Aqua could make could also be made by her mistress. So she suggested that the protagonist try it herself, and explained that it wasn't hard at all. And in order to make wings, the protagonist only had to imagine that her arms had burst out of her back and started to flutter. And then, thinking about it, the protagonist was not happy to realize that she could not imagine such a thing. But Aqua ignored the shock, asked if the protagonist was ready to take off, because she could have safely flown out the window, then added that the girl had spent most of her life in a dark attic, and so it was time to be free like she wanted. And then the protagonist opened the window and thought that Aqua was absolutely right, and said that although she still didn't know exactly what she should do, she was really willing to try to do something like that just to be free. And then told her that she didn't care if it was wings or anything else, but she was ready to jump out of that window. And so she told Aqua that she was really counting on her help. Then, stepping onto the windowsill, informed the water spirit that she was ready and asked that Aqua make her wings. But the spirit is only concerned told a girl that it will not be a problem on her, worried about whether the protagonist is going to return to this place later. After all, if she flies too far away, it will be hard for her to come back here. But at that moment, the excited girl looked at Aqua and wondered why she was saying something like that. She just wanted to fly as far away from this place as possible and never come back. Then she asked the spirit if she had forgotten how long and painfully the girl had endured all this just for this moment. She jumped out of the windowsill and asked Aqua to follow her, but the madly excited spirit only approached the protagonist and asked her to stop a little because she was acting too fast. But the next thing you know, she's conjured wings out of water at the last moment. And then the madly delighted girl, looking around, literally could not believe that she was really flying in the middle of the sky and clouds, and thought about the fact that in such a case, she could safely fly to any part of the world. But the next moment, her wings began to gradually dissipate and turn into ordinary water. And madly excited water spirit, looking at all this, flew after the main character and did not understand what to do. At this time, the girl that was rapidly approaching the ground and thought about what could have happened. She realized that she would probably die in a similar way. But when she opened her eyes, she noticed that she was lying on some kind of small mattress of water. But as soon as she woke up, this water immediately dissipated, and then appeared Aqua, who, excited with tears approaching the protagonist, asked if she was okay. But she calmly reported that although she thought she was going to die, but now everything was really okay. But the madly excited water spirit carefully looked around the girl, asked if she was sure she hadn't hurt herself anywhere. But the protagonist calmly reported that everything was fine, and she felt as well as possible. And Aqua still continued to blame herself insanely for what had happened, and informed that she didn't know how it happened, but her power had suddenly weakened. But looking at her distraught face, Osiria tried every way she could to convince Aqua not to worry so much, because the protagonist didn't think it was her fault at all, and realized it was all because she was impatient. But the next moment, Aqua approached the main character and immediately hugged her and was very touched that the girl wasn't mad at her. But the next moment, there was a noise from people who were excitedly looking for the princess. And then both Aqua and the protagonist immediately turned around at the voice. And the insanely excited Osiria immediately asked the spirit to hide, after all excitedly thought that it seemed like she was about to get into huge trouble. After all, she was too noisy. So now people would definitely want to question her, but she just couldn't think of an excuse for her side. But the next moment, suddenly she was approached by a frantically excited Maria, who looked around the girl wondering if she was all right and if she was hurt anywhere. And the protagonist shockingly didn't realize, didn't anyone really get mad at her right now? And at the same time, carefully examining the body of the main character, Maria excitedly reported that she was madly glad that the girl was not hurt. But the main character, only in shock looking at Maria, did not understand why this girl is crying and what is happening in general, because she expected to see not such empathy. But the next moment, a young man approached them, who, with a maddeningly sad look looking over the protagonist, asked Maria if everything was all right. But Maria excitedly reported that apparently Osiria fell on the grass. And then the protagonist, excitedly looking at Fidelius, could not understand what he was going to do next. But the man only calmly explained that although he was madly glad that the girl was not hurt, but he was really very worried. But the protagonist only looked at him unhappily and thought that it was very obvious. After all, she was a gift from the king himself, so her body was very valuable, and it was impossible for there to be any marks on her body. But the next moment, the knight calmly turned to the butler and asked that, just in case, the man contact the healer and request that the healer stop by tomorrow. And then, looking at the girl, the madly agitated butler said that he would also call the architect, and maybe he could do something like a device with fittings so that one could no longer fall out of the window. And the knight calmly remarked that it seemed to be the best solution to avoid something like this. But at this moment, Osiria was looking at everyone carefully and didn't understand why the looks of all the people in the neighborhood looked so worried. After all, Aqua had always been with Osiria, and Osiria considered the water spirit as her only family. So Aqua's excitement was obvious. But all these people were in no way related to her, especially Maria. But she seemed to be worried beyond belief. So the protagonist could not understand how in just a few days she could start treating a person so well, and thought that Maria probably had some hidden agenda of her own. She didn't know for what reason, but she had a strong feeling that she shouldn't be in this place. And it was as if she were standing on a knife's edge. But at this time, the man only looked sadly at the protagonist and could not understand what he could do to make the protagonist feel better.